Hello and welcome to the Zoology Conference 2024. I'm Floe Foxon, I'm the conference organiser. My background's in physics and data science, and I'm currently employed as a scientist in the pharmaceutical and health sciences. What is folkzoology? Folkzoology is the intersection between folklore and zoology. It's about considering animals that feature in folklore or traditional ecological knowledge, and recognising that some of these may be purely mythological, storytelling, or even hoaxes. Some of them may be misidentified known forms, some of them may have spiritual, religious, or other cultural significance, and yet others may represent new species or new characteristics of known species, for example range extension. The data in folkzoology include geomyths, rock art, anecdotal evidence, purported sightings, circumstantial evidence, and incompletely understood museum specimens. Not all of these data are high quality, but they are interesting nevertheless. Why folkzoology? Well, folk or cryptozoological data are amenable to rigorous analysis. I have two examples here. One's from Paxton. It's a statistical analysis of sightings of unidentified large marine animals that was published in the Journal of Zoology. And another by Brooke, which looked at purported sightings of the thylacine and used those to determine when and where the thylacine might have gone extinct. That was published in Science of the Total Environment. Some discoveries have been facilitated by folkzoology. Not the poster children. We still don't have evidence of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, and it seems unlikely at this point that we ever will. But over 40% of discoveries, rediscoveries, and descriptions of new ape and monkey species from 1980 to 2018 were aided by circumstantial evidence and traditional ecological knowledge. It provides insight into the way people interact with and perceive animals in their environment. Folkzoology is just interesting. Under the banner of the Folkzoology Society, I've published a number of articles in peer-reviewed journals and magazines, and some of those are shown on the screen here. And more recently I published a book with CRC Press titled Folklore and Zoology, which is available from any bookstore or online retailer that sells books. This is the agenda we have for the conference. First we'll be hearing from paleontologist Christine Janis about extinct quadrupedal kangaroos in rock art and the mystery of giant rabbits. Then we'll be hearing from paleontologist Tyler Greenfield about the history of megalodon in cryptozoology. Zoologist Aaron Bauer will discuss his 4 decades of research on the world's largest gecko, and geoscientist Sharon Hill will present on pop cryptids. I then sit down for a discussion with anthropologist Gregory Forth on the Lai-hoa or ape-men of Flores, Indonesia, and how it may or may not relate to an extinct Homo species, Homo floresiensis. And finally, folklorist Daisy Ahlstone will be presenting on manufacturing cryptids and threatened species storytelling. I hope you enjoy the conference.
So I'm Christine Janis. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist, and some of the research I've been doing more recently is on kangaroo evolution, particularly the evolution of locomotion in various giant kangaroos that lived in the Pleistocene. And this is me with a big recent kangaroo, but the ones I'm talking about were like twice this size or more. Anyway, so I'm talking about this idea of this quadrupedal kangaroo that I published on recently, and whether you can find it in rock art and whether it relates to these legends of giant rabbits. So the next slide shows this picture of a skeleton of a species of Proteniodon called Proteniodon anak. And these species lived in the Pleistocene of Australia about from 500 million years ago to 30,000 years ago. So they were certainly there when the indigenous people got there. Proteniodon is closely related to the modern red and grey kangaroos, but many species were much larger, up to 150 kilograms, whereas the largest male red kangaroo is around 80 kilograms. And most big kangaroos today are about 50 to 60 kilograms. And it's known as a giant wallaby. Who knows why exactly, but at that size, it was probably too big to hop. There were all kinds of biomechanical limits to hopping. If you compare this with a regular kangaroo, you can see some pronounced differences. One, it's got a longer neck. It's hard to be a hopper with a long neck. You get whiplash, basically. Very robust arms, very short feet. And then I did some research with Billy Jones, who was a master's student at Bristol a few years ago. And this was picturesque by her. And we determined that its limb proportions made it quite unlike any other extant kangaroo, and probably mainly quadrupedal and not a hopper. So this shows us this idea of this new view. Here's a paleo plushie made by a colleague of mine with Billy. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, can this kangaroo be found in rock art? And I came across this really great picture that was thought to be that of Palekestes. Palekestes is like this big diprotodon-like thing. This is like a big wombat. It's definitely not Palekestes. So the proportions, so it's definitely a large animal. It's not a thylacine, and it doesn't have any stripes like a thylacine would do. It's got a long neck, a long kangaroo-like face, but short feet and robust forelimbs. The tail's a little weird. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. So that, I think, is a piece of rock art that shows Protemnodon. And I found this interesting drawing by a modern day artist that looks very similar in some ways. Obviously, they aren't around today, whether or not it's some sort of folk memory of Protemnodon, who knows? To move on, I was wondering if this animal was behind the folk stories of giant rabbits in the heart of Australia. And I had originally thought that these might be the Silurian kangaroos, which is another group of extinct giant kangaroos. These are quite unrelated to modern kangaroos, and they were also around a similar time as Protemnodon. With their short face, their heads may have looked more like rabbits. But then I found out that these guys actually walk bipedally rather than hopping, and so not at all rabbit-like, in fact. And then think about what's going on with locomotion. Rabbits are often said to hop, but they don't hop, they bound. This is the kangaroo hopping over here in the top. Sort of the middle panel is a bounding locomotion. Very small guys to leap off the back feet onto both front feet. Something the size of a rabbit does a half bound where it lands first on one front foot, then the other. Larger kangaroos don't do a bound at all. They use a pentapedal walk, so called because they're using their tail as a fifth limb, as shown here. But anyway, what I was wondering is if Protemnodon was doing quadrupedal bounding, like Billy and I think, could this critter have been mistaken for a giant rabbit? I apologize for the rather amateurish drawing here I made, but I will say that when I put it into PowerPoint, PowerPoint told me it was a picture of a kangaroo, so I guess it isn't so bad. So in any event, Protemnodon was a very interesting animal. We're finding out more stuff about it. This is a skeleton of a new species found, and you can see these very long legs but short feet, and then these sort of very robust forelimbs and big robust hands. And we certainly know it was known to the indigenous people now, whether or not they must look it for a giant rabbit.
Hello, my name is Tyler Greenfield. I'm a paleontologist who mainly studies sharks and rays, but I've done work on dinosaurs and cephalopods as well. I also study the history of paleontology, paleoart, and of course, cryptozoology. I have a bachelor's degree in geology with a focus on paleontology, and I'm currently working towards a master's degree with the same major. Today I'll be presenting my research on the history of Ototus megalodon in cryptozoology. This material is adapted from 3 papers that I've published, which will be linked at the end of the presentation. To start off, it's first important to understand what Ototus megalodon is and how it's related to cryptozoology. The species is commonly known as the megatooth shark, or more simply, as the megalodon. It's the largest predatory shark to have ever existed, with an estimated maximum length of 59 to 66 feet. Its closest living relatives are lamnid sharks, which include great whites, makos, and porbeagles. Based on skeletal remains, which include preserved cartilage from the nose, jaws, and vertebrae, its body form was likely similar to lamnids. However, its teeth are by far its most common remains, and these are up to 6 inches in length. Megalodon is estimated to have the highest bite force of any animal, and it mainly preyed on whales and seals. It was a fast-swimming apex predator and was even partially warm-blooded. It first appeared in the fossil record around 23 million years ago, and it went extinct between 3.6 and 2.6 million years ago. Its extinction was mainly caused by falling sea levels, which reduced coastal habitat suitable for finding prey and raising their young. Megalodon has been incorporated into cryptozoology through the idea that it's still roaming our oceans today. This is part of the wider prehistoric survivor paradigm, or PSP, which posits that many cryptids are actually animals traditionally thought extinct. Megalodon is unusual compared to most cryptids because it's very popular even though little evidence is used to support it. Generally, cryptids that are similarly popular have many sightings and pieces of physical or visual evidence, like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. In contrast, only a couple of supposedly recent teeth and a handful of poor quality sightings are attributed to living megalodon. As we shall see, the teeth were incorrectly dated and are of conventional age. The sightings are not only of dubious veracity, but also lack any specific characteristics that tie them to megalodon. They have only been associated because it is the most famous ancient shark that the general public knows about. This is a problem inherent to the prehistoric survivor paradigm, where morphology is ignored in favor of reputation when choosing candidates. The beginnings of megalodon in cryptozoology can be traced all the way back to the early 19th century. Around 1816, a fossilized skeleton was discovered near Murfreesboro, North Carolina. It was first described by naturalist Samuel L. Mitchell in 1818, hence why I've nicknamed the specimen Mitchell's Monster. He believed it to be the remains of either a giant shark or a sea serpent. Mitchell could be considered a proto-cryptozoologist, and he initially believed in reports of sea serpents. He eventually became a skeptic after uncovering a series of hoaxes, though. The monster consisted of a vertebral column that was 34 to 36 feet long, and several triangular teeth up to 6 inches long. 2 teeth and 1 vertebra were collected and sent to Mitchell, while the rest of the skeleton was presumably discarded. Unfortunately, these fossils were stored in the Lyceum of Natural History in New York City, and were destroyed when it burned down in 1866. They were never illustrated or photographed, so only Mitchell's brief account has survived. Based on his description, and the sediments where it was found, the monster was most likely megalodon teeth associated with whale vertebrae. Although less likely, it's possible that the vertebrae also belonged to a megalodon. In 1835, Sea Captain Henry Piddington proposed that ancient sharks like the monster could still be alive. He thought they could be responsible for his own sighting in the Philippines in 1816, as well as William Foley's sighting near India in 1834. Both Piddington and Foley reported seeing large fish with spotted colorations, which were later identified as whale sharks. While megalodon was not explicitly mentioned in this case, it is the first connection of sharks with the prehistoric survivor paradigm. Similar ideas continued to appear throughout the 19th century. For example, paleontologist Louis Agassiz, who named Ototus megalodon, believed that some extinct sharks would be rediscovered in the deep sea. The only pieces of physical evidence used to support megalodon's survival are 2 teeth. They were dredged from the South Pacific Ocean floor by the ship HMS Challenger in 1875. In 1959, they were dated by zoologist Vladimir Chernetsky in a paper published in Nature. He claimed that one tooth was 24,000 years old, and the other was only 11,000 years old, long after the accepted extinction dates. To determine the ages of the teeth, he examined the thicknesses of the manganese dioxide layers on them. Then, he divided those thicknesses by the accumulation rate per 1,000 years. Chernetsky did not outright say that his analyses indicated living megalodon, but that was probably his intent, and was certainly the effect they had. He was also a cryptozoologist who studied the Yeti and was an advocate of the prehistoric survivor paradigm. His results were disproven in a 1970 paper by marine biologist Georgy Belyaev and paleontologist Leonid Glickman. Since it was published in Russian, it went unnoticed by most cryptozoologists. First, Chernetsky used an accumulation rate calculated through radium dating, which produces a rate 20 to 30 times faster than more accurate methods. This leads to estimated ages that are incorrectly 20 to 30 times younger. Second, the deposition of manganese dioxide on the teeth began after their roots and cores had already decayed. They had been sitting on the ocean floor for thousands or even millions of years before that. Third, the varying thicknesses and spotty coverages of manganese dioxide show that deposition started and stopped multiple times. For each cycle, the mineral was deposited on different areas of the teeth for different amounts of time. Finally, the teeth of other extinct sharks from the same location indicate an age older than 2.6 million years. These include the ancestral great white Carcharodon hastalis and the hooked megatooth Parotodus benedenii. Ultimately, even if Chernetsky's results were true, they still would not be evidence for megalodon in the modern era. They would only demonstrate its existence until the end of the last ice age. The first and most famous sighting of an alleged megalodon happened near Broughton Island, Australia in 1918. Marine biologist David Stead recounted it in his 1963 book, Sharks and Rays of Australian Seas, which is the best-known source. It was also featured in an obscure newspaper article from 1918. Stead interviewed anonymous lobster fishermen who said they saw a shark that was either 115 or 300 feet long. It was entirely white in color, but they did not give any other details of its appearance. It ate their lobster traps whole, which were each 3.5 feet wide, and took a bite out of one of their boats. Stead was unconvinced of the extreme lengths, yet he asserted that it was a megalodon. He may have been biased by outdated size estimates and by his earlier speculations that sea serpents were actually giant sharks. The Broughton Island shark was closest in size to whale sharks, which are the largest living sharks that grow up to 60 feet long. An albino or leucistic individual has been observed, so an all-white coloration is possible. However, the behavior does not match whale sharks at all. They are filter feeders with vestigial teeth and narrow esophaguses, so they would not be able to crush or swallow lobster traps. They certainly could not take a bite out of a boat, either. The behavior lines up better with great whites, which are known to attack fishing gear and boats and occasionally eat crustaceans. Albino and leucistic individuals have been documented too, so again the all-white coloration is possible. Yet, they only reach 23 feet long and are far smaller than whale sharks or the Broughton Island shark. Given how unlikely it would be to vastly overestimate the size at such close range, a hoax is the most plausible explanation. The 1918 newspaper article revealed that there was a severe storm in the area on the same day, which could have damaged the equipment and boat. The fishermen probably invented the shark story to avoid reimbursing the owners for these damages. The second most famous sighting is that of novelist and fisherman Zane Grey, which was featured in his 1931 book Tales of Tahitian Waters. It occurred close to the island of Rangiroa, French Polynesia, in 1928. When Zane and his crew were reeling in tuna, a 35 to 40 foot long shark approached their boat from below. It was yellowish-green colored with a few white spots. It had a square head and large pectoral fins, and its body was up to 8 feet wide. The last third of its body and tail was noticeably thinner than the first 2/3. The shark ignored the hooked tuna, swam under the boat, and then dove down and disappeared. The whole sighting only lasted for a few seconds. The length is within the range of whale sharks, as is the coloration. Although they are more commonly said to be blue, gray, or brown, they can look yellowish-green depending on the lighting conditions and water clarity. Lighting and clarity can also reduce the visibility of their numerous white spots. The head and pectoral fins being much wider than the posterior body fits the overall shape of whale sharks. Additionally, the lack of interest in the tuna is expected since they do not eat fish that big. Therefore, the shark that Zane saw was most likely a whale shark. He insisted that it was not one, though, and instead called it a man-eating monster. This was despite the fact that he had seen a whale shark before, and even described its color and morphology similarly. He might have been influenced by stories of a square-headed, man-eating shark from Fiji, which was identified as the local shark god, Kawekaweau. Zane's son, Lauren, had a sighting of his own, which he wrote about in the 1976 book, Shark, the Killer of the Deep. It took place 100 miles northwest of Rangiroa in 1933, while he and his father were traveling on the ship SS Maunganui. Lawrence spied a shark emerging from the ocean and alerted his father, who also witnessed it. It was 40 to 50 feet long and had a rounded head 10 to 12 feet wide. It was yellowish-brown in color and had a massive tail that protruded from the water. It was covered with hundreds of white spots, which were shown to be barnacles when it came closer. Lawrence stated that this shark was the same kind his father encountered 5 years earlier. He likewise contended that it was not a whale shark, but again that species is the best match. The length and wide rounded head are compatible, and at first, the yellowish brown and white spotted coloration seems to be too. However, the spots being barnacles and not patterning cast doubt on the account. All pelagic sharks have hard scales that prevent barnacles from attaching to their skin. Whales can have barnacles, but they are difficult to mistake for sharks at near distances. Lauren was sure that it was a shark when seeing its tail, implying that it had a vertical caudal fin and not a horizontal one like whales. This paradox is a telltale sign that the sighting is a hoax. There are other odd inconsistencies, like Zane never mentioning it in his books. Lauren changed the date to 1928 in a later interview, but he was not really with his father at that time. Lauren may have been motivated by jealousy, as he wanted to be a better writer than his father. He made up his own story about a cryptid Zane originally recorded on at least one other occasion. David Stead included another sighting in his book Sharks and Rays of Australian Seas. It was communicated to him in a 1939 letter from Sea Captain J.S. Elkington. Elkington observed a shark while in a stalled boat off Townsville, Australia in 1894. It was a few feet longer than each end of the 35-foot boat. It was yellowish-white colored and looked most similar to a great white. The shark laid motionless within 10 feet of the boat for 30 minutes. The combination of the size and great white-like body plan fits a basking shark, regardless of Elkington thinking it was not one. The color is also possible because albinism has been found in this species. On the other hand, the behavior contradicts that identification. Pelagic sharks need to swim continuously to both breathe and not sink, so they could not stay still for half an hour. Whales can remain stationary while sleeping, but they are hard to confuse for sharks, as previously explained. This discrepancy suggests that Elkington's sighting is a hoax. There is no corroborating evidence that it preceded all other sightings, so it might have borrowed from them. The coloration could have been taken from the Broughton Island sighting, and the length from Zane Gray's. Strangely, it was plagiarized by marine biologist Theo Brown in his 1973 book Sharks, the Silent Savages. He changed the date to 1963 and length to 85 feet, but otherwise it was essentially the same. Pilot and fisherman Pierre Klosterman highlighted the following incident in his 1969 book Such Big Fishes. When the ship Rachel Cohen was traveling by the island of Timor in 1954, it collided with an unknown object on a stormy night. Upon dry docking in Adelaide, Australia, 17 teeth that were each 3 inches wide were found embedded in the hull. They were arranged in a bite mark with a 3-foot radius near the propeller shaft, which was bent from the force. The culprit was a great white, estimated to be 79 feet long. The Rachel Cohen was a real ship from Australia, but it was destroyed by a fire in 1924, 30 years beforehand. It was once claimed to be the victim of a shark attack, but this was caused by a mix-up. In 1897, shark teeth were removed from the hull of the ship Eclipse while it was dry docked in Adelaide. Then in 1926, a newspaper article repeated this, but accidentally switched the Eclipse for the Rachel Cohen. Klosterman probably drew from the latter version, but he seems to have added details from a different attack as well. In 1950, a fishing boat in Streaky Bay, Australia, was assaulted by a 17-foot great white. Its head stuck 3 feet out of the water, and it bit and left 3 of its teeth in the boat's planking. Klosterman possibly changed the 17 feet to 17 teeth, 3 teeth to 3-inch teeth, and 3-foot head to 3-foot bite radius. Everything else was likely fabricated, such as the 1954 date and the location being Timor. Writer Thomas Helm recalled his sighting in his 1961 book Shark, Unpredictable Killer of the Sea. He did not say the date, but based on contextual evidence, it occurred sometime between 1935 and 1950. While on a fishing trawler in the Gulf of Mexico, he watched a 30-foot shark rise out of the depths. It was either black, dark blue, or dark brown in color, and it resembled a great white. It stayed below the ship for over an hour, and its pectoral fins were visible on either side when it was directly underneath. Its only movement was slowly sinking and then floating back up until it eventually swam away. There are similarities to J.S. Elkington's sighting, namely the shark sitting by the boat for an extended period and its great white-like shape. These must be coincidental because Helm's book was released before Elkington's account was published. Nonetheless, there is still the problem of the shark not swimming and being unable to breathe. Additionally, it could not float up without moving forward since sharks are negatively buoyant. Helm claimed to have experienced other cryptids too, such as a cat-faced sea serpent and 2 giant blue sharks. Given the low likelihood of seeing multiple mystery animals, it is more probable that he was prone to telling tall tales. Another potential sign of a hoax is that the captain of the trawler was supposedly named Kidd. This may be a joking reference to the famous pirate and the fact that Helm wrote a book about treasure hunting. The concept of extant megalodon has been popularized through cryptofiction, which is fiction about cryptozoology. This in turn has led to its spread in media lore, which is like folklore but is transmitted by audiovisual media like television and the internet. Alan Dean Foster's 1976 short story, He, was the first work of fiction about a modern megalodon. In it, the shark lived down in the Tonga-Kermadec Trench and came to the surface to attack humans. Steve Alten's Meg series, that started in 1997, are the most famous novels about the subject. He moved the setting to the deeper and better-known Mariana Trench, which has become a popular trope online. The books were adapted into blockbuster movies in 2018 and 2023, reaching a wider audience than ever before. The black demon shark of the Sea of Cortez is sometimes believed to be a real legend referring to Megalodon. However, it first appeared on the TV show Monster Quest in 2009, and there is no evidence it existed prior to that. A self-titled movie starring the black demon came out in 2023. In 2013, the Discovery Channel aired the pseudo-documentary Megalodon, The Monster Shark Lives, followed by a sequel the next year. They used fake photos and videos of living megalodons and actors posing as scientists to deceive viewers. They naturally caused backlash from the scientific community, but that did little to mitigate their effects. Clips from them continue to circulate online and mislead people a decade later. Another piece of footage went viral on the internet in 2016. It was alleged to be a megalodon in the Mariana Trench, but was really a sleeper shark filmed in Japan in 1989. This video has been recycled by various tabloids and was promoted on the TV show Strange Evidence in 2020. If you're interested in learning more about the history of megalodon and cryptozoology, I recommend reading these papers that I've written. I covered the subject in much greater detail than I could here, and included a full list of references. I plan on writing more about it in the future, involving the unpublished material discussed here, so stay tuned. Here are additional references for some of the images used in this presentation.
Hi, I'm Aaron Bauer. I'm a professor at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. I'm primarily a herpetologist. I work on systematics, biogeography, and morphology of lizards mostly, especially geckos. And my introduction to cryptozoology came in the 1980s in conjunction with the topic that I'll talk to you about today, which is the Kawekaweau, the world's largest gecko. This story begins in 1983 at the Musée d'Histoire Naturelle de Marseille, which you can see in the photograph here. The museum was founded in 1819, and from my perspective in herpetology, it had no trained staff and no known collection, no collection with types or specimens of scientific value. But in that year, the assistant in charge of their small herpetological collection, Alain Delcourt, wrote a letter inquiring about a large gecko that they had in their collection that had been on display for a number of years, as long as he knew. He first wrote to George Zug at the Smithsonian, and George forwarded that to Garth Underwood in London, who was a gecko expert. And Garth, who was retired at the time, sent that to Anthony Russell in Calgary, Canada, who was my postdoctoral advisor at the time, or postdoctoral advisor a few years later. We were working together at the time in 1983. And he passed this on to me because I was planning a European museum trip at the end of 1983 through 1984. And what came with this letter was a set of positive prints that seemed to be enlargements from x-rays of this specimen. There wasn't a lot of information about the actual size of the specimen, but it was clear that this was a very big animal. So given the interesting nature of this, I included Marseille in my itinerary for my collection, and in December of 1983, I went to Marseille. I had a big surprise when I got there. Alain Delcourt, who's shown here, holding this specimen, took the specimen out. He had taken it off the display, and it was in a plastic bag in a file cabinet. And when he took this out, it completely blew me away. It turns out that those positive prints that were sent were not enlargements. They were actually contact prints from the x-rays, which meant that this animal was really huge. And that size alone immediately showed me that this was a new species. No other gecko got anywhere near this size. This is by far the largest gecko ever known. The snout vent length, or the head plus body length, which is a standard measurement for lizards, was 370 millimeters. And I'll return to that in a minute to give you a sense of how big that is in gecko terms. Unfortunately, there was no accompanying data, no tags, nothing associated with the specimen. So it's just this specimen to work with. Normally, the lack of data like this would argue against preparing a description of something. One would try to get additional material, find out more about the specimen. But in this case, this was so exceptional, so obviously different than anything else, that my inclination was to collect all the data I could and to begin working on a description of this as a new species. So to give you a sense of what the size means in gecko terms, at the top you see on the left Rhacodactylus leachianus, which is the largest known living gecko, which reaches a maximum size of about 256 millimeters in head and body length. And next to it, to scale, you see the giant gecko from Marseille, and you can see just how much larger that is. If you look below, you see a variety of size categories and some representatives of geckos of different sizes there. So on the left, you see a Europlatus, a Madagascan leaf-tailed gecko, which is in the very large category of geckos, up to about 200 millimeters. To the right, you see a Eublepharis, or a leopard gecko, which is also very big, not quite as large, but still very, very big. And these are all animals that are in the upper few percent, upper 3 to 5% of body size for geckos. In fact, the vast majority of all geckos have a body size of around 45 to 55 millimeters. There are 2,300 or so gecko species. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,800 or so are in that range or smaller. So 370 millimeters, or a total length with a tail of 632 millimeters, that is just over 2 feet long, is really exceptional. What did I have to work with, given that there were no data with the specimen? I did have some morphology. I knew from the x-rays I'd received that the specimen was sort of strangely prepared. It was a taxidermy mount with no vertebral column and no limb girdles, but it did retain the skull and the forelimbs and the hind limbs. And in the lower image here, you can see the little arrow is pointing to a small bone that is at the back end of the animal, and that is a cloacal bone, which is something that's found in males of many groups of geckos. So this told us that the specimen was definitely a male. One of the things that we could see from the X-ray was, first of all, that the animal's head was sort of grossly inflated, unnaturally inflated, which was obvious from the outside of the animal. But we can see that there's a large skull on the inside, large enough along with the limbs to show that the length of that specimen is approximately correct. In other words, this was not some hugely distended specimen. This was a specimen where the skeleton is commensurate with the size of the outside of the animal. The other thing we could see, and that's shown in the arrow in the upper left, is the third and fourth digits of the hind leg are parallel to one another, and in life they would have been tightly bound to one another, and that turns out to be a character of some usefulness for identifying what kind of gecko this might be. So that feature, the pairing of the third and fourth digits, and you can see that here on the lower left where you're looking at the outside of the digits, you can see those kind of parallel bases to the third and fourth digits. That is something that is typical for a group of diplodactylid geckos. And diplodactylids are one of 7 families now recognized for geckos. This is a family that's only in the Southwest Pacific. The other thing that was characteristic for diplodactylids is seen in the lower right, not on this specimen, but on another diplodactylid, a living diplodactylid specimen. And this shows the precloacal pores. These are pores in front of the animal's cloaca, extending out onto the hind limbs, that produce a sort of waxy secretion that the males produce for chemical communication. So these features told us that this animal must be a diplodactylid. And more specifically, it can only really be a diplodactylid from one of 2 places. The group as a whole occurs, as I said, in Australia and also in New Zealand and New Caledonia, so only in the Southwest Pacific. None of the Australian groups have those features that I just showed you in that particular form, but the species that occur in New Caledonia, which is shown in the sort of pinkish box on the map, or in New Zealand in the greenish box on the map, these are the ones that have those features. And so unambiguously, the specimen by itself could tell me that this was the origin of this. This specimen must have originally come from one of these 2 places in the Southwest Pacific. So how do you tell which place it might have come from, given that there were no labels, no data? So the digital morphology more closely resembles that from the New Zealand geckos. So if you look at the bottom left, you'll see on the far left a New Caledonian giant gecko, Brachydactylus. On the far right, a large species of New Zealand gecko, Hoplodactylus duvicelli. And in the middle, you see the Marseille specimen's foot. And you can see a couple of things here. One is there's really no webbing on the giant gecko, which is similar to the New Zealand form, but not to the New Caledonian one, which has some webbing between the digits. Also, you can see that the distal parts of the digits have this arced structure with a large part of the toe extending beyond the adhesive pad. That's also shared between the New Zealand form and the giant gecko, but not in the New Caledonian one. And finally, the New Caledonian gecko has a broad pad, whereas the New Zealand form and the giant gecko have a somewhat narrower pad. The giant gecko also has a series of annuli or rings around the tail, which are shown in the middle with those red arrows indicating where these lie. And these are just a slightly different scale size that is repeated along the length of the tail. And on the far left, you can see what at the time was known as Hoplodactylus rachiuri, and if you look at that, the red arrows there show the comparable structures. You might be able to make out this slightly different scalation every so often, periodically along the length of the tail. And this is something that we see in the New Zealand forms, but not really in the New Caledonian ones. So the morphological evidence pointed to a New Zealand origin. However, New Caledonia is a French possession. It's a French territory. New Zealand, of course, is not. And New Caledonia has a large number, relatively speaking, of giant geckos, whereas in New Zealand there's really only one large gecko species, and it's not as big as the ones in New Caledonia. Well, we can look at color pattern of the living forms, and it turns out that two species, which at the time were placed in the genus Hoplodactylus, a New Zealand diplodactylid genus, have a color pattern that is sort of strikingly similar to what we see in the giant gecko. So if you look here at Hoplodactylus chrysocereticus and Hoplodactylus stevensii, which is now in the genus Toropuku, you can see that the color pattern is quite similar, especially in the stevensii. You can see that very sort of reddish-brown striping on a otherwise brownish body. And I should point out here that the giant gecko itself is covered with some sort of shellac, which is sort of browned over the years or darkened over the years, so that pattern is evident, but the original color is probably a bit obscured. Given that information, in 1986, Tony Russell and I described this as a new species, Hoplodactylus delcourti. Hoplodactylus was the genus of so-called brown geckos in New Zealand, and so we allocated it to that on the basis of its morphology. So this implied, of course, that this was a New Zealand species. This was something that had occurred in New Zealand. Why didn't anybody know about it? Well, probably because it must be extinct, or if not extinct, it must be on the brink of extinction and very restricted in its occurrence. When the paper came out, I got very mixed reactions from within New Zealand. I had some people who were very excited that this was an incredibly interesting find, and I had other people who really would not believe that this could possibly be from New Zealand. And they pointed out things like, well, the color pattern is so similar, maybe it's just a big individual. Well, the difference between a 50 millimeter individual and a 370 millimeter individual is really beyond comprehension. It's not possible that these could represent the same species. I also had arguments that the specimen was a hoax, that it had been stretched out, but the x-rays revealed that there is an 80 plus millimeter long skull inside of this. 80 millimeters is by far larger than 95-97% of all geckos' total length, or total head and body length. So clearly, even if this was stretched a little bit, it's far larger than anything that is known to have lived before. So there was a bit of a mixed reaction. And one of the reactions I had came from J. Richard Greenwell, who was the founder of the International Society of Cryptozoology. He was also the secretary of that society and the editor of the journal Cryptozoology. And he was sort of my introduction. I had always been interested in cryptozoology, but I hadn't really thought of my own work as a zoologist being cryptozoological. But he pointed out that the case of Hoplodactylus delcourti was really an ideal case. It was a case where we have an actual almost complete body, in this case, more than we have in a lot of cryptozoological cases, but we still have the mystery of where does this come from, how did it get there, why did nobody notice it all these years. And we can use the same sort of sources that we would generally use in a cryptozoological study, that is archival sources, folklore, interviewing people, trying to get additional information that might shed some light on this. So that got me involved in cryptozoology, and after that I was on the board of the International Society of Cryptozoology for quite a number of years. One of the things we can say about this animal is that it seems that it is ethno-known, and ethno-known was a term that J. Richard Greenwell had used for discussing these types of taxa where the indigenous people of an area have knowledge of this specimen or of this species that might not be known to science. or in this case, was not known to science until 1986. So in this case, what was known came from Maori legends. So the Maori people of New Zealand had legends or folklore or traditions that talked about large reptiles. And one of these was mentioned in the European literature by Meyer in 1873, and this was an animal called the Kawekaweau. And you can see in the quote there that the Kawekaweau was described as being about 2 feet long, as thick as a man's wrist, and brown, striped longitudinally with dull red. That is a pretty accurate description of this giant gecko from Marseille. And if you note, the date of the observation was 1870. So that wasn't all that long ago. It's within historical times, within the time of written records. So this is an intriguing connection. In the paper that you see on the left, Tony Russell and I made this connection, suggested that the Kawekaweau or Kawekaweau was this Hoplodactylus delcourti, that there's information from not only that literature source, but others from tradition, from artwork that suggested that this could be this giant gecko. Graham Hardy in 1977, working on skinks, another group of lizards that occur in New Zealand, made the argument actually that this species, the Kawekaweau, actually was perhaps a poorly known skink that he was working on at the time. In either case, there seems to be some argument for the connection between this Kawekaweau and a living or recently living species of New Zealand lizard. And the information, when you take it all together, suggests that all the localities that have been mentioned are in the North Island of New Zealand, and all of them refer to this Kawekaweau as being either arboreal, tree-living, or rupicolous, rock-living, which is what you would predict from the morphology of the specimen. If this is the case, if the specimen seems to match New Zealand Hoplodactylus, and there's information that suggests that the animal might be ethno-known to the Maori people, why don't we have any data with the specimen? How is it that this specimen doesn't actually have any paperwork, so to speak, to back it up? Well, the museum was founded, as I mentioned, in 1819. And prior to the mid-19th century, locality data weren't generally very much appreciated, and museum records often have very imprecise data. So that might not be so surprising if the specimen were collected sometime in the early history of the museum. We know that the specimen almost certainly can't have been from after the beginning of the 20th century, because from 1902 onwards, accession records for the museum are sort of consistently present. So we know where specimens after 1902 came from. They have origin recorded. They have any collection data. This has nothing. Between 1833 and 1869, there are in fact no surviving records from the museum in Marseille at all. So this is a window that might match when this specimen could have entered that collection, and would explain why there are no records today, because those records were destroyed. That window of time also includes the brief period of French whaling activity in New Zealand. Between 1836 and about the mid-1840s, the French were quite active in whaling in New Zealand waters. So there was a presence there that could explain how something from New Zealand ended up in a French museum. And it should be remembered that at the beginning of this period, in the 1830s, this was before the Treaty of Waitangi, and this would be before the time frame that Britain had annexed New Zealand. At the same time, if we ask about New Caledonia, the other potential source area, it was annexed by France only in 1853. And before 1853, there was little prior activity in New Caledonian waters by the French. So in fact, during the period that this specimen might have originated, the French were more active in New Zealand than in New Caledonia. The other thing that could be said is the fact that there are no data with this specimen could also reflect that this was not a specimen collected by a ship's naturalist or even by a ship's officer. Under those circumstances, one would expect that there would be some record. Somebody would have written something in their diary, somebody would have written something that was published someplace, because the specimen is so spectacular. But if it was obtained by a sailor and brought back and either donated or sold and ended up in the museum, there might not be that kind of record. Lastly, if you look on the right side, you see on the underside of the giant gecko that it's been cut and stitched up the middle, also down the length of the middle of the tail and out onto the hind limbs. And this is a method shown in the figure to the left of the giant gecko that was used for large lizards from the mid-18th century to the early 19th century. So this also suggests that this specimen is likely from this sort of time period. Very unlikely to be from the 18th century, as this part of the Pacific was not very heavily visited by Europeans up to that time. It's only a few decades after Cook was exploring in the region. But the early 19th century looks to be a very promising time for that style of taxidermy. That diagram, by the way, is from a book originally published in 1758. And so that style of taxidermy lasted for quite a few decades. After the description of the giant gecko and a few years had passed, and that initial reticence on the behalf of people who had doubts seemed to sort of melt away. And in 1990, the specimen was actually brought to New Zealand, where it was on display at the National Museum of New Zealand in Wellington, kind of as part of the natural heritage of New Zealand. So there was an acceptance there that this was a unique surviving specimen of an extinct species. We also had some work that we did and other people in New Zealand did, looking to see if there was any chance that the species was still alive. No information was found to support that, but some potential habitats that could still support populations, especially the kauri forests of Northland New Zealand, were identified as a potential place to look in the future. Very high canopy, difficult to access the canopy, and a potential place where this animal could still survive, or maybe survived until the relatively recent past. In the more recent past, after the 2000s, we see that the gecko starts to appear in sort of popular culture and in other places, so that it was commemorated on a stamp from Mozambique, of all places, as part of a set that looked at extinct island taxa. And in 2017, the name Kawekaweau was used as the title of a novel that was published that is connected to New Zealand. It takes place in New Zealand. So the Kawekaweau sort of has, since its description nearly 40 years ago, crept into popular culture, popular knowledge. That was a long time ago, and I was a graduate student at the time, but after that, my interest in New Zealand geckos continued. In 2011, I published with Stuart Nielsen, one of my master's students at the time, as well as some of my other colleagues in the US and in New Zealand, a phylogeny of New Zealand geckos. And we used molecular data for this. This was the first time that there was an extensive use of molecular data for New Zealand geckos. Of course, something we did not have in 1986 to help confirm the identity of Hoplodactylus delcourti. As a result of this phylogeny, we recognized 7 genera. There had been only 2 recognized before, and we recognized many species, about 40, whereas there had been fewer than 20 recognized before. So the molecular data revealed that there was a lot of unrecognized cryptic diversity in the group. The animal that's pictured here is an Altinus. It's a representative of the genus of New Zealand green geckos, as you can see. The brown geckos were all in Hoplodactylus, which you see in bold there at the time that we described Hoplodactylus delcourti. But now there are these additional genera that have either been resurrected or described as new. And the 2 that have the asterisk, Woodworthia and Toropuku, are the ones that today have those species that I illustrated before, both of which were in Hoplodactylus at the time, that have that striped pattern that we see today. So from this work, although we included Delcorti still in Hoplodactylus, maybe it belongs to one of the other genera that have the similar color pattern. The most recent work that we did is last year in 2023, where we were finally able to do something we couldn't do before, which was use DNA to be able to confidently place the giant gecko into the phylogeny of geckos as a whole. And we were able to do this using an ancient DNA approach to generate genomic data that would allow us to identify those relationships, to look then at the group to which Delcorti belongs to say something about body size evolution in that group, and then also to go back and evaluate whether the cryptozoological evidence that we used in the 1980s and 90s could be corroborated today. The first thing we had to do was extract DNA, and very kindly the museum in Marseille provided one of the femurs from the specimen, which you see isolated here. And we tried initially to do the least damage possible to extract DNA from the dried muscle fiber that is adherent to the bone surface, so that irregularity on the surface is bits of sinew and dried muscle. But the results gave no measurable DNA, and when we tried to amplify this, the results that we got, well, all we got was an indication of either the lizard genus Anolis from the New World, or we got human DNA. This is not surprising because the lab that we first tried to sequence this in was a lab where people worked on Anolis, and so there was a lot of Anolis DNA contaminating the lab. The next lab didn't have Anolis, was not a vertebrate lab, but the DNA from human workers in the lab overwhelmed the very degraded DNA that might have been present in the muscle on the surface of this bone. One needs also to remember that during the course of the taxidermy, this bone would have been handled, and subsequently the bone would have been exposed to a variety of other external sources. So for a number of years, we didn't go any further with this because we didn't really have access to a completely clean lab. Our next attempt, however, we used a Dremel to drill into the bone in the area shown by the arrow, and took bone powder from inside the shaft of the bone. And ultimately, to make a long story short, that worked. That gave us uncontaminated DNA, degraded, of course, because the specimen was approaching 200 years old, but DNA nonetheless that could be amplified. So we sequenced that DNA using both traditional Sanger sequencing, which is what you would use to look sort of one gene or one marker at a time, as well as high throughput sequencing, which can be used for genomic studies where you're looking at a much larger portion of the genome and generating many sequences. We compared the DNA that we got from the giant gecko to existing gecko sequence data, much of which we had earlier generated in our lab and some of which we downloaded from public sources. And we generated two main data sets. One was a multi-gene data set with 169 species, including the majority of the diplodactylid geckos. That included 15 genes, 13 of them nuclear and 2 mitochondrial. Many more genes were generated in the sequencing. However, these were the genes that we had comparative information for and genes that were known to be relatively informative. So these were the ones that we used. We also generated the mitogenome, the entire mitochondrial genome, for 39 species and looked at relationships using that. Both our high throughput sequencing and our Sanger sequencing for looking at an individual gene retrieved identical sequences. So that's good. That reinforces the idea that the results were reliable. And one gene that we used was ND2. This is one of our most commonly used genes for gecko relationships. It's a mitochondrial gene. And it interestingly put Hoplodactylus delcorti in the New Caledonian clade. You can see that with the red arrow. not in the New Zealand clade. But this is just one mitochondrial gene. So maybe this was just an artifact. Maybe this is something that a bigger data set would give us something different. Well, it didn't. Looking at our multi-gene analysis with 15 markers, it turns out we saw several things. One is we did retrieve New Caledonia and New Zealand as a unit, the clades representing those two groups, as being distinct from each other and last sharing a common ancestor about 45 million years ago. The dashed blue line that you see near the base of that tree lines up with that time period of about 45 million years. And this is what all previous studies had retrieved, that New Zealand and New Caledonia were not each other's closest relatives, but each one is instead related to a different group of Australian diplodactylids, and that's the uncolored part in the middle there, where there is no box over the tree. And Hoplodactylus delcourti is embedded deeply in the New Caledonian radiation, and you can see the red arrow there is pointing to Hoplodactylus delcourti. The silhouettes there represent the proportional sizes, so that giant silhouette is delcourti, and those bars that you see that the silhouettes are overlying are the actual measurements of the largest snout vent length, and you can see there that delcourti far exceeds anything else. So in addition to showing that delcourti was not a member of the New Zealand group, not a Hoplodactylus, which was down in that red box below, the results showed that this giant gecko was not assignable to any of the other giant geckos in New Caledonia. It was a member of a different genus, a new genus, that had diverged about 18 million years ago from any of the other geckos in New Caledonia. And so in the paper that we did last year, we described this as a new genus for this gecko, and we used the name Gigarcanum, which is a name that means giant mystery, which we thought was very appropriate for this animal. Having that result, we were interested to see what the evolution of giant size looked like in diplodactylids. And the diagram that you see on the right shows time on the x-axis and log of body length on the y-axis. And so the spread across the y-axis is giving you the size range that you see. And you can see in blue that the New Caledonian size range is much larger than either the New Zealand size range, which is in red, or the gray, which is the Australian. And that it's also skewed towards the larger body sizes. And that's even without delcourti, which you see there as the orange line that is branching off within that blue part of the tree. And what this shows us is that the New Caledonian radiation has a significantly higher rate of body size evolution than we see in either the New Zealand or the Australian forms. And it looks like that started very close to the base of the New Caledonian tree. So you can see right at the base of the blue branches there, they're right at the start, diverging towards the lowest and the highest values in terms of size. And so somewhere along the base of that branch that leads to New Caledonian geckos is where we think that shift in rates of size change had taken place. So very early in the history of the group. The other interesting thing is that when we look in detail at this, the suggestion is that there have been actually at least 3 different cases of the independent evolution of giant body size in New Caledonian geckos. And these are in the genera Rhacodactylus, Nearogecko, Corylopus, and of course now Gigarcanum. But there's also another lineage, and that's seen here at the very bottom. This is just a blow up of that part of the tree, the New Caledonian part of the tree. You can see a red arrow near the bottom pointing to a very long branch, that is a long bar here on the histogram, which is a size factor. And this is a unnamed gecko, still yet to be named, that we discovered in 2016 and is in the process of description right now. And this is a partly aquatic gecko, which is a very strange thing. And what's interesting is it looks very much like a New Zealand gecko. On the top right, you see this new gecko from New Caledonia. On the bottom right, you see Dactylocnemus, which is a New Zealand gecko. And these animals are very similar in general appearance as well as in more specific details of coloration pattern. And if we look at the toe pads, here again we see a Rhacodactylus from New Caledonia on the left, and we see a Hoplodactylus from New Zealand on the right, and in the middle is this gecko, this new gecko from New Caledonia, and it actually is sort of intermediate. It has some webs between the toes like New Caledonian geckos, but it has the long, extended, arced, free portion of the digit at the tips, and the digital pads are somewhat intermediate in width, but closer to the New Zealand forms. So maybe it's just the case that looking like a New Zealand gecko is a thing in giant New Caledonian lineages. Maybe that explains why Hoplodactylus delcourti, or now Gigarcanum delcourti, looks so much like a New Zealand form. But although that might explain the morphology, it doesn't explain the cryptozoological information about the Kawekaweau. What about the Maori legends, traditions, the European reports of those? What about other sources that suggest that this animal came from New Zealand? Well, phylogenetically, there's no doubt delcourti is a member of the New Caledonian clade, and we can do something that forces it to be in the New Zealand clade. We can force it analytically to take that place, and it results in a significantly less well-supported tree. And so that's pretty good evidence that this the genetic evidence does not at all support this being a New Zealand species. And this makes sense geographically because New Caledonia has so many other large-bodied geckos. Another case of enlarged body size there wouldn't be surprising. But again, we're left with these other records. So is it still possible that Gigarcanum could be a New Zealand gecko? Well, having worked on this animal for 40 years, I would like to believe, but that's not the way that science works. But there is a case that could explain how this animal could be still from New Zealand, even though it's a member of the New Caledonian lineage. And that can be seen by comparison with this phylogeny of South Pacific leaf beetles, where the New Zealand members of this group, which are shown in orange, and the cases of those are illustrated with those red arrows, are embedded within an otherwise New Caledonian lineage. So the blue bars that you see, the blue branches on the tree, are New Caledonia. So in this case, these New Zealand leaf beetles occur in New Zealand, but they are members of a New Caledonian lineage. And this could be what has happened in the case of the giant gecko. It's possible that Gigarcanum is indeed a member of a New Caledonian radiation, but that it moved over water, colonized over water to New Zealand. And the timing that we see in this leaf beetle example is actually consistent with what we see with the timing of Gigarcanum, which was separated from its nearest relatives about 18 million years ago. And this is the period in the early Miocene that corresponds to the period shortly after the reemergence of New Zealand. It's now understood that New Zealand and New Caledonia were either completely or nearly completely inundated in the past during particularly the Oligocene, and that in the early Miocene we have the reemergence of New Zealand. New Caledonia re-emerging a bit earlier. So in this case, this would imply that Gigarcanum could have colonized New Zealand in the period shortly after its re-emergence, when it became available for recolonization. So that is something that I am holding on to as a possibility that can be tested. And there is, in fact, a way that this can be tested. And I am going to mention here two different approaches, both of which I'm interested in following up on and carrying on with further research on Gigarcanum delcourti. One is to use forensic palynology, using pollen from either the outer surface of the skin or perhaps the inner surface inside the taxidermy mount, to see if there are any pollen grains that are present that could be identified on the basis of their morphology or potentially of the sequencing of those pollen grains. This is a method that has been used successfully in a variety of studies in various zoological groups, but also in archaeology. The other alternative is to use stable isotope analysis of claws or bones or teeth to try to identify whether this animal spent its life in New Zealand or New Caledonia or potentially someplace else. And this approach has been less widely used, but a recent study looking at the snail genus Placostylus in both New Caledonia and New Zealand showed that there were differences in the profiles of these stable isotopes between those two places, showing that it is possible to identify whether the animal came from one place or the other. The difficulty in this case is that one would need some additional reference information, which we would need to generate before we would be able to make any definitive decisions about this. So that gives you an idea of kind of my main cryptozoological interest that I've been following now for 40 years. This one particular animal, and I like to think of it as sort of a success story for cryptozoology because one, we actually have a body, we have a complete body, missing only the vertebral column and the girdles and some of the soft tissue, but we have the skin and we have the skull, so we have some of the most important parts. We have enough to make some estimation about phylogenetic placement. And now we have the DNA that we've been able to use to come up with a rather more definitive phylogenetic placement. We are still left with the mystery, though, of where the animal itself came from. We know where its lineage comes from, but where did the animal itself come from? And so this leaves open avenues for future research, some of which will be along the lines I indicated here, using palynology and stable isotope analyses. But I'm also always on the lookout for unpublished diaries, information that might be hidden out there in archival sources where somebody may have mentioned when this specimen reached Marseille or when this specimen came into somebody's possession. So it remains a mystery, and I would be grateful if anybody has any further information or suggestions for this. I would like to finish the study on this after all of this time and come up with a conclusive answer. So with that, I will give some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank all my colleagues, both in the U.S. and in New Zealand, as well as other places, for collaborating. The Musée d'Histoire Naturelle de Marseille made this all possible, first by letting me access the specimen 40 years ago, but then by providing the femur for study for our latest DNA work. I'd like to thank the late J. Richard Greenwell, who sort of recruited me into the International Society of Cryptozoology. Funding sources, Villanova and the National Science Foundation of the U.S. have supported my work on geckos around the world for the 36 years that I've been at Villanova. And finally, I'd like to thank Floe for the invitation to participate in the Folk Zoology Society conference.
This is Pop Goes the Cryptid. I'm Sharon Hill. In this presentation, I'll argue that there has been an inevitable change in the cryptid landscape from its original intent due to two main developments. One, the collapse of the professional efforts of cryptozoology, and two, the impact of media of all kinds to bring about an explosion of content and commercialism related to mysterious creatures. Together, these factors resulted in a proliferation of ideas about cryptids that stray far from the original goal of identifying unknown creatures in a zoological framework. Instead, we see the rapid diffusion and amplification of unnatural cryptids with fantastical characteristics, as well as classic and new cryptids portrayed as supernatural, cute, social, or romantic. Let's start with an example of a modern media representation of popular cryptids. For Halloween 2023, the news media organization Axios conducted a tiered voting poll. It's not clear how the authors chose the creatures to consider, but the choices seemed interesting. There were obvious entries: Chupacabra, Jersey Devil, Mothman, Bigfoot, and Champ, but no Nessie. Instead, we have two admittedly spirit creatures, La Llorona, a ghost legend, and the Wendigo. Two werewolf-type creatures, the Rougarou and the Michigan Dogman, and the rest are a motley crew of legendary or pop cultural creatures. This voting poll by a general news site can be taken as a snapshot of what the general population thinks of as cryptids, with only about half of the 16 entries here that might represent an arguably scientific zoological mystery, or a misinterpretation of a typical animal. The rest have decidedly non-zoological origins or characteristics. Obviously, you are curious about the winner. Traditional cryptids Champ and the Jersey Devil didn't even make it out of the first round. The final four were Bigfoot, Chupacabra, Mothman, and, bit of an outsider, the jackalope. In the finals, Chupacabra edged out Bigfoot 51 to 49%. The difference in viewing cryptids of today, from the original idea of seeking, quote, unknown animals as part of cryptozoology, is stark. The original aim of cryptozoology was to be a sub-discipline of zoology. The key figures in the founding of this field, Bernard Heuvelmans, among others, intended it to be a serious endeavor. They criticized established scientific institutions for not devoting attention to the stories of unidentified animals that may represent important new species. In the 1980s, this field of study reached the height of its scientific reputation with participation of many prominent scientists in a professional society, the International Society of Cryptozoology, with its own journal. It was not far-fetched to think that those specializing in cryptozoological methods could be the ones to bring to light some of the many large animals that remain to be discovered using the clues from local people. Cryptozoology aimed to be a serious field led by zoologists and scholarly professionals. But from its inception, stories of unusual creatures had been imbued with unnatural or supernatural elements. A primary problem of scientific cryptozoology was how to manage those aspects. The fantasy and fictional aspects inherent in many cryptid stories made it difficult for academic study. Particularly unfortunate was that important social aspects of the folklore tales and contemporary legends were disregarded. In other words, cryptid stories were removed from their important social context and uses. Selective filtering out of weird characteristics was encouraged. The scientific proponents deliberately diminished magical features of popular cryptids, depicting them instead as flesh, blood, pelts, and paws. If the cryptid in question was associated with spirits, shamanistic magic, or witchcraft, or if it had supernatural abilities inherent in the local legends, those attributes were brushed aside in an effort to scientifically legitimize the being. This process was aptly termed weirdwashing, a term coined by modern author Tim Renner, or whitetrofitting by podcasters Trey the Explainer and Miles Greb. While the weirdwashing was intended to elevate the discourse on mysterious animals, it could not be effectively suppressed entirely, and coming up we'll see why. Meanwhile, by the early 1990s, cryptozoology as a scientific field was already in trouble. The scientific endeavors encouraged by the International Society of Cryptozoology hadn't panned out. Several attempts to document Bigfoot, Nessie, and Mokele Mbembe, a creature of the African wilderness thought to be a living dinosaur, had not been successful. Hoaxes were rampant. Media products that emphasized mystery and exaggerated features of cryptids, however, were successful. In 1999, Fortean writers Coleman and Clark said in their Cryptozoology A to Z book that cryptozoology was, quote, an integral part of our culture. In terms of Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and the Yeti, this was undeniably true. It's around the turn of the 21st century that we see the word cryptid begin to gain popular usage. First, just in the cryptozoology scene, but with the growth of cable television and the realistic docudrama genre, internet forums, and social media, cryptids leave the sphere of scientific speculation and grow in contemporary culture and lore in a huge way. One prominent example is Monster Quest in 2007, a TV series that explored current thinking about cryptids. This program was influential in showcasing cryptids and that people were actively looking for them. Monster Quest inspired many to dive into the subject themselves. Yet such programming again tended to weirdwash the history. According to paleozoological scientist Darren Naish, descriptions of cryptids always reflected the cultural and scientific beliefs of the era, changing over time. This was an aspect that was not explored in short TV episodes, but the changing descriptions were also a strong argument against that cryptid being a real biological animal. Using the Google Books Ngram viewer, the data shows how often the words cryptozoology and cryptid appear in a corpus of books over the selected years from 1960 to 2018. First, we notice the rise of cryptozoology in the 1980s, when the professional society and standing rises. The concept of scientific study of unknown animals is becoming more culturally known. Around 2000, we see the start of the popularization of the word cryptid published. Note that the internet was well on its way to connecting the world by this time. The media boom lifted both terms. But in 2014, there was a sea change. The term cryptozoology stagnated as the term cryptid took off. This can be attributed to social media influence that encouraged and spread content about strange creatures. Monster stories trended. People clicked on them, and there was a proliferation of local monster tales and publications. This trend was also evident in internet search habits. This is a graph of Google queries for cryptozoology and cryptid in the US. Again, we see something about 2014 that signaled a shift in the popularity of cryptid that unexpectedly seemed to reinforce the decline of cryptozoology search term. It was as if the zoology part was no longer deemed useful or interesting. Beginning around 2007, as with the Ngram data, we see cryptids start to rise. What happened in 2014? As far as I can tell, this spike was mainly the result of the premiere of the History Channel show called Cryptid, the Swamp Beast, dramatizing alleged encounters with a mythical swamp creature in the southern U.S. We could argue that this really cemented the idea of cryptids as exaggerated monsters in pop mainstream. Starting in 2005, fictional products appeared that used cryptids. Cryptids appeared on television, all over the internet and social media, in fictional literature, games, community festivals, and eventually as part of personal identity. The mysterious and paranormal elements were emphasized because that proved to be enticing to audiences. So the result was a fun but exaggerated depiction of cryptids in popular culture. Here are some examples from 2005 to 2013. Roland Smith's Cryptid Hunters Young Adult Adventure Series, the hugely popular Messin' with Sasquatch promotion for Jack Link's Jerky, the cryptid hunting cartoon family in the Secret Saturdays show, the discovery and explosion of interest in the Montauk Monster, a raccoon carcass discovered in New York, the fictional 2009 series Lost Tapes on Animal Planet, which was at the time viewed as an educational channel, and the stunning children's book on the legend of the Jersey Devil in 2013, one of the many books that commercialize cryptids for young children. And in the center, symbolizing the importance of cryptid tales to local communities, is the Mothman statue of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. The answer to the mysteries of cryptids became less important than the situations and tales that could be spun from them. The possibilities expanded far beyond "is this an unknown animal?" question. Now, a cryptid could be any kind of entity, real or imagined. The more important aspect was belief and the utility of that belief. Useful forms of this belief manifested in consumerism, tourism, identity, either personal or regional, and in a person's overall worldview. Without a scientific society or official cryptid gatekeeper anymore, creation and manipulation of cryptids was an open process made simple by worldwide platforms for self-expression. The internet made existing ideas freshly available to a new generation. The options for sharing ideas was greatly expanded. New ideas sprung up, evolved, and hybridized. every new story of a cryptid may have minor changes, some of which survive to the next telling and continue to become ingrained. With no scientific documentation, cryptids are untethered to reality, biological evolution, and zoology. They can freely evolve culturally, and so they did. Popular culture rewarded the expansion and remixing of these ideas, the creation of new cryptids, and the repopularizing of past cryptids for present purposes. Even though cryptozoology failed as a scientific endeavor, there will always be a portion of cryptozoology proponents that consider it to be strictly zoological, who insist that unknown animals will still be found and that occult and paranormal aspects should be excluded and disparaged. But the fun in believing in the folklore aspects of cryptids as mysterious and magical creatures can be more rewarding and useful. It's impossible to rein in the current popularity of cute and creative cryptids in the popular culture. As with literary and film monsters, cryptids were excellent to use to illustrate cultural values. They could be stretched, blended, and bent into different shapes for necessary purposes. In the social media age, the word cryptid expanded to now incorporate all types of weird entities. This trend is often denigrated by old-school self-styled cryptozoologists who insist a cryptid is still a potentially classifiable zoological animal. As I suggested in the last slide, that horse has left the barn. Here are some modern examples of cryptid expanded. Your cat can be a cryptid if he's mysterious and rarely seen. Loeb is a haunting creature in the form of a frightening woman said to have been created unexpectedly by an image algorithm and called the first AI-generated cryptid. The term cryptid is used to describe any weird sentient thing, like an unexpected and surprising human form, or possibly, in the oddest example, a machine that has unusual and bizarre features as well as a mysterious origin. New in the 21st century are efforts people make to construct a personal identity to share with the world via social media. Known as aesthetics, these are a collection of core elements that form an overall theme and mood adopted by a person as part of their social identity. The cryptid core aesthetic focuses on interest in creatures from legend and folklore. Note that it does not strongly identify with scientific zoology. Cryptid core is not highly focused on the biological reality of the animal, but on the paranormal, mysterious, and quirky aspects of cryptids. Other core elements are interest in unexplained phenomenon, conspiracy ideas, and attraction to mysterious or haunted places. The origin of cryptid core can be traced to 2014 on Tumblr, where it emerged from the fan bases of television shows of the 2010s. Once again, we see a clear outcome of how media content has been an indisputable heavy influence on the modern view of cryptids. Cryptid core embraces the cute, funny, magical, romantic, and spiritual characteristics of cryptids, and the merchandise flows from these favored themes. Today's efforts made in seeking and studying a cryptid are frequently less about solving a mystery and more about fashionably performing one's values, beliefs, and identity. Today's cryptid enthusiast readily admits to enjoying and enhancing the spooky, offbeat, and mysterious aspects of the subject. This is the opposite of what I previously referred to as weirdwashing or retrofitting. Instead of demythifying a cryptid with a purpose to catalog it to fit into the biological tree of life, the paranormal aspects are emphasized. The cryptid enthusiast embraces legend trips and cosplay. They embrace diversity and glorify being the other or the outsider instead of fitting into usual cultural norms. To wrap up, instead of being seen as potential zoological creatures as initially intended at the birth of the field of cryptozoology, cryptids have become immensely useful as contemporary legends. Can scientific cryptozoology return? And should it? Although several advocates wish for a return to the strict zoological investigation of cryptid claims, that framework was not successful, and there are many reasons why it failed. The modern world is not the same as that of 19th century colonialist explorers. Considering the lack of any progress made in finding Bigfoot and other cryptids, There isn't any justification for that outdated version of cryptozoology. But that does not mean that the field of study dies. Like modern cryptids, the field has evolved, and they are more popular than ever. We must make way for culturally popular cryptids that people love and recognize the social implications. Modern cryptozoology now means scientifical performing. That is, talking and acting like one imagined a scientist would in order to sound credible and convincing about cryptids. Though this is not new, social media provides a worldwide platform to do this like never before. We also have a resurgence in local folklore, town-specific cryptid festivals, and adoption of cryptid-related symbols as representations of our personal identity. We have ample evidence for the rise in popularity of paranormal themes, and of the development of the paranormal as a folk religion, or what Dr. Jeb Card calls the paranormal unified field theory. A prime example of these ideas all coming together is Skinwalker Ranch, that includes a plethora of paranormal phenomenon claimed to be occurring in one place and possibly caused by a hypothetical single supernatural cause. This is the trend. All levels of society and government play some role in this active story. Will the paranormal trend collapse and the scientific view reemerge on top again? Not if the current superstars of cryptids, the dogmen, have their say. It's hard to predict what will trend in the coming decades. But without the body of a genuine high-profile cryptid being discovered and exposed for the world, we are in the age of post-cryptozoology cryptids.
I'm speaking with Dr. Gregory Forth. Dr. Forth is an anthropologist with a PhD from the University of Oxford in England and worked as a professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta in Canada for over 3 decades. In his 2022 book, Between Ape and Human, Forth analysed dozens of reports of apparently hominoid animals, or ape-men, known as Laihoa, not formally described in conventional zoology, but which feature prominently in the culture and local knowledge of the people of the island Flores, Indonesia. The question of whether these are mythological, or a cultural memory of an archaic Homo species, or misidentified monkeys, or a new primate species, or something else entirely, is still a matter of debate. Greg, thank you for joining me.
Well, I'm very glad to oblige.
Now, before we get going, you mentioned to me just now that you have reservations about the word folklore. So why is that?
I think because, as most people understand it, it suggests something that is always fantastic, not based in any sort of empirical reality. Whereas, it's been shown that very often there is some basis, with elaboration perhaps, but nevertheless some basis for some of the things that come up in the local knowledge, as I would prefer to call it, of non-professional scientists, non-academic scientists. So I stay clear of it. It has to be used with some caution. I think, although things like the ape-men of Flores, specifically a particular region in Flores. Ape-man is the word that's or the phrase that's truest to the local language, among other things. Also, the way they describe these creatures.
How did you first become aware of Flores and the characters or animals featured in the local knowledge there? And when did you first hear about the ape-men?
Well, I began field research on Flores in 1984, which was nearly a decade after I'd done doctoral research on a neighboring island, Sumba. And at the time, 1984, when I first went to Flores, I to research particularly into the culture and history of the Nage people in central Flores. I didn't have any particular interest in exploring the topic of ape-men or cryptids of any sort on Flores. So, like many things in ethnography, I came across the representation claims about creatures like the ape-men. quite by accident, quite early as it happened in my first field visit, largely due to certain kinds of questions I was asking of local people, certain topics I introduced to them, and I was quite struck by the similarity with what I'd heard in the Nage region, and yeah, things kind of took off after there. Although in the case of the Laihoa, it was just weeks after a month or more after I heard about the Leo ape-men that um, Homo floresiensis was the remains, hominin remains that were labeled as such, were discovered in the far western part of Flores Island. Now, that find, of course, wasn't announced to the world until the following year, late October 2004, I think. It was in the journal Nature. I got some wind previously from a member of the paleoanthropological team that something remarkable had been discovered. But I wasn't, of course, at liberty to tell anybody else. But nevertheless, it sort of changed my thinking. I guess you could definitely say about the possibilities of these creatures on Flores. That is, that perhaps they weren't they weren't purely imaginary. Just to underline, I heard about these things in these creatures in Leo before Homo floresiensis was discovered, and certainly long before the discovery was announced.
Early on in the book, you discuss conflicting reports about humanoid creatures, and sometimes they're described as entirely naturalistic entities, in other words, maybe real but unidentified animals, and other times they're said to have, supernatural abilities. And some of the latter reports may arise from translation difficulties. I really like the example you give in the book, which is a rock that apparently transformed into a cow. Can you tell me more about this and how you overcome some of these language barriers as an anthropologist?
Well, it's only a barrier, of course, until you start to overcome it. But yeah, one always has to be aware of the meanings of words, and indeed the meaning you first grasp, first referent of a particular word, one has to always realize may not be, the full extension of the word's meaning, such as instead of something turning into something else, something turns out to be something else. You suddenly or not so suddenly have a different impression, a different understanding of what it is, and that was the case with the rock that changed into a cow.
Yeah, another example you give is that known existing animals like the dugong are sometimes credited with supernatural powers similar to ape-men by the local people.
Yeah. I can mention another example of the linguistic issue, and that has to do with the reports by some people that the Laihoa, if I can, keep using that term for the ape-men, the Laihoa have tails, but very very short ones. Other people said they don't have tails, but they're quite often described as looking like monkeys or apes, but without tails. The only monkey that's locally known on Flores is a long-tailed macaque, which, as the name suggests, has a very long tail indeed. In fact, longer than the body. Whereas these creatures were said either to lack tails or to have very small ones. In some cases, also people said, well, they do have tails, but In fact, a number of cases, people said they have tails, but they're not visible. That they're hidden under the pelage, the hair, or whatever. They're just not evident. Um, and I thinking about this, I realized that there were two things one had to understand here. First of all, although very human-like, the Laihoa are described as animals. They're categorized as animals, and one feature of the Leo language, indeed, is that animals always have to be described in terms of tails. I mean, an animal is defined as a creature with a tail. And indeed, from there, I went to ask local people, particularly local people who had been to Borneo and claimed some knowledge of orangutans and gibbons. And I asked, well, do they have tails, those apes? And the response was, well, yes, they must have tails because they're animals, or because they're apes, which are animals. So I thought, well, this is certainly something to consider in understanding what people say about the Laihoa.
And elsewhere in the book, you describe first, second, and even greater hand accounts of ape-men encounters collected in your fieldwork, which you undertook on no less than 20 anthropological expeditions to Flores over the span of almost 4 decades. And you note that some of these are probably misattributed encounters with the long-tailed macaque, which is a small monkey known to exist on the island. But not all eyewitness accounts are entirely consistent with that explanation. Another possible explanation is that some ape-men sightings might be primates like gibbons and orangutans that are known to exist on neighbouring islands in Indonesia, but are not currently recognised to exist on Flores.
I mean, there's a bit more to it than that. Yeah, orangutans, of course, are only known from Borneo and Sumatra at present. Gibbons have a somewhat broader range, but no, the point is that all those creatures are to the west of what's still referred to as Wallace's line, which means that they belong with a lot of other animals such as tigers and tapirs and elephants, indeed. To what's called I think it's still called the Asiatic biogeographic or zoogeographic realm. Yeah, you certainly wouldn't expect it would be a terrific, a tremendous discovery if they were found in a place like Flores. Although the Wallace line, or Wallace's line, has, so to speak, been breached before. Most notably in regard to stegodons, these ancient elephant-like creatures which have been were discovered, in fact, in the 1950s. Fossils thereof in the 1950s on Flores. So it was shown that, yeah, whereas it was thought that those stegodons never crossed Wallace's line. In fact, they did, and yeah, so I guess it's possible. But something I mentioned in the book about orangutans and gibbons as well is that these are both the apes which live high in the canopy. So that they would be, if they were present at all, they would be, very likely noticed regularly, and also, yeah, zoologists academic zoologists would have heard about them. I should have thought by now. Also, they're very, very vocal, also in ways that the ape-men are not said to be. I think of the cries of gibbons, which carry a long way through a jungle. Yeah.
And you mentioned that there was a case of an orangutan skull that turned up on Flores, but orangutans aren't officially known to exist on Flores, so what happened there?
Yeah, in Leo, there are a number of people, a number of men who had been to Borneo and had seen orangutans and gibbons, which um, is perhaps all the more remarkable in relation to that point I made a bit earlier about their saying that orangutans and gibbons are animals, are apes, therefore they must have tails. You'd have thought they would have noticed them, but apparently, some people who say Flores ape-men have tails claim these can't be seen as well. So, there's a kind of parallel there. As regards to the skull, it's very possible. In fact, very probable, I should say, that the person who possessed this had brought it back with him from Borneo. It definitely is an orangutan, by the way, and it doesn't look very much like the skull of Homo floresiensis, for example. So and there was just the one skull. Other people who'd seen specimens, dead specimens of Laihoa described something quite different, from an orangutan. So again, I mean, orangutan hypothesis not great. On the other hand, and of course, another thing is that that there's no record of orangutans in the paleontology of Flores Island. Whereas, and this is an important contrast, it was for me, whereas we have, of course, found um, fossil materials, skeletal materials of non-sapiens hominins. In Western Flores, with regard to the Homo floresiensis.
Other cultures have ape-men traditions of a sort too, right? I mean, in North America you have Sasquatch or Bigfoot. In the Himalayas you have the Yeti, and elsewhere in Indonesia even you have orang pendek. So what do you think it says about human culture and the way we think about animals when different groups of people have similar folk zoology? Do you think it says more about the people or the animals?
I don't know if you can give a categorical answer to that question. I mean, certainly there are, yeah, different cultures differ, but there are also, many similarities across cultures, constants, in fact, things that look like universal ideas. Not to digress, but in relation to something I'm working on right now, the witch, what I call the image of the witch, is remarkably similar, on all continents, in fact, including obviously Europe. In cultural anthropology, also the topic of universals hasn't proven, perennially has proven not to be a terribly popular one. And yeah, there is a tendency, I suppose, to try and explain away quite remarkable similarities. Not everybody, I think, has an ape man, and I don't think. I mean, just to say that there's a possibility, a very high possibility, even that something like an ape man is reported in one place by members of one culture. A culture exists. That doesn't mean to say that the same goes for everywhere else. So take the Bigfoot or Sasquatch, for example. There is no fossil record of giant apes in the new world. Somebody unearthed one at a sufficiently recent date that would really rock the boat and hit the headlines, because of course the Bigfoot is well known among English speakers or Westerners generally. But no, there is no fossil record, although yeah, it has been speculated, of course, that the Bigfoot may be a latter day version, a descendant of a Gigantopithecus, a large Pleistocene ape from Asia, which yeah could have crossed the Bering Land Bridge at some time with a lot of animals, but it's a bit of a long shot, that one. Whereas of course Flores, you got one you're talking about the same island here, so again the coincidences kind of pile up, and that's that's what got me going on this project in the first place. Yeah.
And finally, what do you think the future holds for ape-man research on Flores? What sort of future expeditions do you envisage?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. I'm retired now, and getting on a bit, not as healthy as I used to be. So I'm not planning any kind of um, research as such on Flores or anywhere around about in the future. As it happens, my wife and I are visiting Flores. Probably our last visit in towards the end of September and into October, but that wouldn't be a research trip. Although, as always, I'll be talking to people and probably asking a few questions about this, that, and the other thing. As regards other people, since the book appeared, the hardcover in 2022, and then the paperback just last year, I've had quite a bit of interest. A number of people have said that they would like to visit for, well, not just visit Flores, but to actually try and find physical evidence of ape-men, which is something I didn't set out to do, as I say in the book. Yeah. Another guy has been in touch with a German man, in touch with me quite recently. He had a plan for using drones to see if there's anything that looks like human remains, or rather hominin remains, shall we say, animal remains there that would make further investigation worthwhile. I know other people who other natural scientists indeed who seem to find the possibility of a let's just say something like the ape-man, the possibility of finding that on Flores to be a real possibility, although of course by no means certain that one could be found. Something I made sure to do in the book, in the two last chapters, was to point out the difficulties of researching this question zoologically or primatologically, in terms of the whole structure of academic science. I mean, to have a research design project proposal accepted with the Laihoa, evidence from ethnography, even though it looks pretty good, as indeed I think my Laihoa material does, it just won't pass muster with the powers that be. In the same so it would be difficult to say the least. I think you would have to first have kind of a verifiable visual, at least, uh, of the creature, or I mean, better still, a body part, skeletal or otherwise, before you could go ahead and mount a scientific expedition. I also discussed reasons why local encounters with Lahore um, haven't found their way really off the island. Why they've never been reported to local officials, say, or if they have, why local officials haven't, followed up. So yeah, I mean, with all cryptids, I think it's very important, considering their status, to understand, and when they're reported, of course, by local people, to understand the cultural context of this kind of knowledge.
Dr. Gregory Forth, thank you.
Okay, well, I hope that was helpful.
Hello all, welcome to my talk, Manufacturing Cryptids. My name is Daisy Ahlstone, and in this presentation I'll be discussing cryptids, extinction, and thylacines, but most importantly I'll be discussing how cryptids are made by people, what elements are similar across stories that we tell about them, how we narrativize our encounters with these creatures, and how we might be able to predict what species could become cryptids in the future. But before we dive into a discussion on cryptids and folklore, I thought I would take a moment to introduce myself and my orientation to this subject. So my name is Daisy Ahlstone, and I use they, them pronouns. I'm a folklorist, cryptozoologist and legend scholar, eco-philosopher, mycologist, and collective joy enthusiast. I am excited when you are excited about things. I'm a published author, mostly on thylacines and folklore for the moment. I'm also the current director of Wise Folk Productions, the producers of YouTube and Twitch streaming channel called Folkwise, which explores a study of tradition non-traditionally through digital content creation, public education, and direct community engagement. In my day-to-day life, I'm a PhD candidate at Ohio State University in the Comparative Studies Department, which is located on unceded territory of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, and other indigenous nations. I'm interested in questions about community sustainability, systems thinking, and more than human community member contributions to the transmission of what we call everyday knowledge in the world of folklore. You might have heard me say that I'm a folklorist and wondered A, what that is, and B, if this is something that you can study to be professionally, and the answer to B is yes. But the answer to A is that folklore has many definitions, but one of the most simple ways I've seen it summarized is by my former advisor, Lynn McNeil, who says folklore is traditional informal culture. Traditional means passed down through time, so it has something to do with history and how those things change over time. Informal denotes that you learn the stuff of folklore from person to person, everyday interactions. Often this is shared through family or friends or other communities that you spend time with in your daily life. And culture in this definition means socially learned expressions of a group of people. So you might say a particular community's culture, right? And a particular community's folklore for that matter. Think the memes that you send to your friends online, or the stories that you tell around the campfire, or the rites of passage that you experience throughout your own lifetimes. What I'm interested in as a genre of folklore are legends, and in particular, ecological legends that we share to help us understand and explore our relationships with the natural environment. This is one of the places where folklore and cryptids exchange entry into each other's worlds. So now that you know a little bit more about me and folklore, and how I think about ecological legends, I want to invite you to ponder, what is a cryptid? I personally define cryptid as a being with contested existence. These creatures are often studied under the purview of cryptozoology or cryptobotany, which you are all very familiar with at this point. But these communities rely primarily on local knowledge in conversation with Western ecological sciences to better understand the cryptids themselves and the roles that they play in our worlds. That local knowledge in particular is what I'm interested in as a folklorist, and how those knowledges are formed in conversation, independently of, and in direct opposition to institutions. But there's more than just contested existence to what makes up a cryptid. I've been working on a 3-part narrative assessment for determining the cryptidness of verifiably extant creatures, particularly to include those with contested existences that relate to species loss through extinction because of our current climate crisis. This, I hope, will be useful for developing a cryptid narrative genre of legends and point to patterns in the general public shifting relationship with threatened and endangered species in our lives as the necropolitical implications of the climate crisis take hold on our non-human communities, even more than they already have. What do these values expressed through cryptid legends tell us about who share them? Do the storytellers' perspectives change about the mysterious animals that they encounter? How have these stories about cryptid encounters changed over time? What can cryptid legends tell us about not just the shifting relationship with non-human animals, but with the environments that they inhabit as well? These questions will be explored throughout this presentation. One more thing before we get into the cryptid legend motifs. Throughout this presentation, I will of course be using thylacine as my core example to explore this notion of cryptid motifs, but I have incorporated a sort of audience challenge in this presentation, which I hope will give you a taste of the embodied experience or the embodied practice of searching for the thylacine, like thylacine researchers presently do in Australia and Tasmania. Or at least we're going to get as close as we can get to that kind of field, the search for the thylacine, behind a computer screen. So in each of the following slides, I have hidden a thylacine that looks like this. Please follow along and see if you can find them all. They're in every single slide. It's going to look the same, but it's going to be hidden somewhere. The search for the thylacine, the belief in its continued presence in the wild past its otherwise institutionally recognized extinction, and how those beliefs are enacted through both legends and artwork is precisely what I hope to unpack in this presentation. So play along at home. Using an example of the thylacine, I'll unpack the folk narrative motifs that contribute to the creation of cryptids, the movement from animal, plant, or fungi into the world of liminality that cryptological species occupy. I argue that cryptids do not appear, but rather are made through the sharing of narrativized encounters that reify these particular motifs. I want to note here that the story of the thylacine that I'm going to be using as an example to guide us on an exploration of these motifs is a story of settler design. The dominant narrative of the thylacine's and many cryptids' contested existence has arisen from settler-descendant interpretations and relationships with cryptids, land, and with colonization. I want to make it clear that this particular assessment of cryptid legends has surfaced within a backdrop of extreme colonial violence. Some motifs which make it into the stories that we tell today about cryptids, and that indigenous perspectives of these animals, commonly known as cryptids today, are the subject of a different presentation and are often different than the settler colonial framings of some of these stories, or even the nature of contested existence. So we'll be working through what that means for the thylacine as the story unfolds, but I want to make that note up front. So now onto the motifs. So here are the 3 core motifs that I've identified so far that show up in early stories about cryptids. A distinct, non-normative physical body or markings. Something about the animal, plant, creature, being has to have something that is atypical for animals and related species, for things that have been known to institutional science, to presently recognized normative animal body types, or it can have a marking that kind of like take it just outside of that frame a little bit too. The second is liminal regionality. These cryptids, the things of cryptids, the stories, have to place the cryptid in somewhere that's between worlds of the human and the beyond human. These are places like, think of the woods, right? Think of the bottom of the sea. Think of the sewers in a city center, right? These are places that either humans don't live all the time or are just beyond human reach. The third is threat to human life or human ways of life. think like agriculture, or it's poisonous or something like that. It has somehow, the cryptid is embodying, in the stories that we tell about it, a kind of perceived threat to humanness, whatever that is. So it could either be by harming you physically so you die, it could be messing up your economic system, it could be doing something that is making it more difficult for humans to do human stuff. It's a threat to their life or ways of life. I came into this conversation through past research on recently extinct and threatened animal species, beliefs about those beings, and the artwork that we make of them. My primary work has involved the shifting perceptions of the thylacine, which is also known as the Tasmanian tiger, over the last almost 100 years since its extinction. This animal, and cryptid, is particularly interesting to me because it was once extant, living alongside humans for thousands of years, only to have recently become extinct due to a combination of factors, but most notably the effects of colonialism. You may find these motifs are most accurately applied to the animals and plants with institutionally validated existences who have later become cryptids as their extinction status took over. Additionally, I include in this assessment the reversal or subversion of these motifs. You'll see, for example, a lot of playful modern thylacines at the end of this presentation that do some of that work. Each of these subversions is still speaking to the core elements of existing settler narratives about cryptids. So think along with me about these motifs as I share the history of the thylacine and detail examples of these motifs in thylacine legends throughout the last century. I argue that identifying these motifs in stories told about present, threatened, and endangered species helps cryptozoologists predict what plants and animals might become cryptids as we note fewer and fewer of them in the wild. First, let's take a closer look at who I'm talking about today, the thylacine. Finally, we're getting to the good stuff. These are some of the last images that we have of thylacines held in captivity, taken in the 1900s. What do you notice about them? What do you wonder? Have you seen this animal before? Have you ever heard of it before this presentation? You might have noticed a few things about this animal. It's a quadruped, so it walks on 4 legs. It kind of looks like a dog or a wolf, maybe, a carnivore, probably. It has stripes. It has a thick tail that's like really stocky, kind of just like slides off the body. The thylacine in the top right picture has a really big open jaw. It can open its jaw more than most carnivores, which is pretty interesting. Something that you can't glean from this photo really is that the thylacine is actually a marsupial. So marsupials are a subset of mammals that gestate externally using a pouch rather than placentally inside of their own body. So that's kind of interesting. It's much more similar to like a kangaroo or a possum or a wombat, a wallaby, all those different kinds of animals, right? Mostly, though, endemic to Australia with the exception of the possum. But yeah, so there's a lot going on here with the thylacine, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff that makes it look like really similar to some animals, but really different at the same time. I think there's something here about the body. Most cryptids tend to have an exploitable bodily feature to them, something like non-normative about them that makes them distinct and charismatic and cool, like the thylacine's stripes and its jaw are just like awe-inspiring. It's interesting. You don't see other animals like it, right? Yeah, sometimes this like bodily abnormality contributes to the threats that they're perceived to have against humans as well. We can touch on that more later too. Second, there's this motif about liminal regionality. So place and environment are crucial to understanding the formation of cryptids and their role in our world. This is Tasmania on a map for those of you who have not seen it before. It's one of the southernmost islands in the world and is home to the thylacine. You can see part of Papua New Guinea in the north, right sort of quadrant of this map. And on the southeast of the image in the bottom right corner, you can see New Zealand. So New Zealand is more south than Tasmania, but we're still talking very, very far south on the planet in its totality, right? Both of these islands I mentioned, Papua New Guinea and New Zealand, are important because they're also places that people suspect the thylacine to be hiding out today away from the colonial eye. So these are other places that people believe there are small pockets of thylacines roaming around in the wilderness. So here's Tasmania a little bit closer up for you, an actual map of Tasmania. So now you know where it is in the world. Now here's a little bit closer. People have compared Tasmania to Isla Nublar in Jurassic Park or other Lost World type places. So here, obviously, on the left, you can see Tasmania, and then on the right, I have put an image of Isla Nublar from Jurassic World, the most recent map. So you can see there's like some similarities in terms of size, in terms of topography. There are some parts of it that give it this kind of mystic place, right? It's known to have erratic weather. Cryptids tend to be found in more remote or otherwise not inhabited by human places. So the woods, the swamp, the city sewers, on top of high mountains, in the bottom of the sea. There's a mystery to where they reside, and it's out of human reach, or at least out of frequent human reach. What might be possible for us to imagine about the kind of animals that live here? These are some pictures of Tasmania. Actually, all of them are from Tasmania, so no more Isla Nublar talk. But what do we already know about Australian mammals? What kinds of environments do they need? What are the ways that they make livelihoods in this kind of environment, right? Marsupials are unusual. They're taxonomically, they emerged earlier in the evolutionary timescale, although that's a little bit misleading because evolution isn't linear. But the idea that they are somehow kind of primordia of mammal is interesting. The environment in Tasmania is really different from the Northern Hemisphere, right? And not to mention that it's also a colonized place that did not always have this Western hegemonic dominance that it has today. So historically, Europeans mostly, who colonized Tasmania and Australia, were met with this new and exotic place that mythologized Tasmania as a kind of other, right? A legacy that persists today. It's projected onto plants, animals, and people in the midst of neocolonialism. There's a projection of the Eurocentric imagination onto the difference of both land, animal, and people who are found here, which has had a profound effect on the ability to craft an animal with contested existence, right? This brings us to that motif again of liminal regionality, the notion of an in-betweenness or between human and non-human occupied space. This is an expression of a colonial relationship to land, a relationship that assumes man and nature are separate and that the boundaries between human, civilized society and the non-human environment, wilderness, are to be crossed towards the pursuit of scientific discovery. I know that there's a lot to get into on this subject, but the key takeaway here is that the motif of liminal regionality can only exist from a perspective of Western colonialism, which shows up in the way that we talk about cryptids, thylacines, the stories we tell about them, and about all beings with contested existences, right? This kind of juxtaposition between human and wild. We've got some core elements that could begin forming the thylacine into a cryptid, but we are missing another key factor that shows up in cryptid narratives, a perceived threat to humans or human ways of life. So over time, the colonization of Tasmania did irreparable damage to the island and its people, not to mention all the plants, animals, fungi, and spirits. And this damage has had continued and lasting effects. The turn of the 20th century in particular is where we pick up our thylacine story. This was a key time period for many threatened species and marked one of the first times that many people took action to actually protect endangered species. But conservation was really slow to establish. The thylacine, along with many unique marsupials in Australia, had a relationship for a really long time with humans prior to colonization. What happened when Europeans, mostly British and Irish, settled in Tasmania was the amplification of big agriculture, which included logging and livestock rearing, namely sheep. This led to a dramatic loss in habitat space for the sensitive animals of Australia, animals that exist nowhere else on Earth. The thylacine had a hard time keeping up. These images here are scans of newspaper clippings that describe the thylacine as being harmful to sheep and livestock. These mark the point where the treatment of the thylacine began to take a dark turn. They became persecuted by farmers who had they became persecuted by farmers who had settled in Tasmania for their role in harming agriculture. Imagine just for a moment you'd been sent away to a colony due to your criminal behavior and are now tasked with making a living rearing Northern Hemisphere sheep in a recently occupied Southern Hemisphere environment where you know next to nothing about the people and environment you'll find yourself in. Riddled with legitimate fears of wolves you had instilled in you since you were a child, upon noticing your sheep were suffering and lambs missing, you begin to wonder if wolves are also in Tasmania. For what else is out there in the strange new world, to you, that would continue to perpetuate your own self-induced bad luck? It's easy for many colonizers to make the thylacine their scapegoat by sharing stories about the sheep that it had stolen from them, ignoring their own theft of land at the same time, but bonding with their fellow neighbors in a united front against the unwieldy and possibly dangerous animal. You can see why the thylacine, along with its non-normative body and the wilderness of its homeland, was set up for failure in the eyes of colonizers. These claims about the thylacine's threat to agriculture were one of the most prolific narratives of what eventually led to the thylacine's extinction. This is a photo and a fictionalized representation of what happened right before the photo was taken that represents a bounty scheme that was carried out by both the Australian government and private companies against thylacines. Now, bounties for desirable animals were common, but the thylacine was particularly vulnerable to these programs because of the beauty of their stripes, the public perception of them as agricultural pests. That, plus population bottleneck of island residents, and likely a widespread disease affecting local fauna, the thylacine was no match. The thylacine became officially extinct in the 1980s, but the last known confirmed sighting of the thylacine was in 1936 of the animal in captivity. Extinction, however, can be a blurry line. How do you really know you've counted every single last thylacine, especially in the thicket of the Australian bush, a place that continues to have huge areas of land unoccupied by humans? And I know that extinction is more complicated than that, but imagine you think that it's down to the wire. We have the example of the last thylacine, Benjamin, affectionately referred to as an endling of the species, right? This is like an extinction studies term for the last representative of a species that is occupying some kind of ecological niche in the environment that it finds itself. Now that we have these narrative motifs established and have seen how they show up in thylacine legends prior to its institutionally recognized extinction, let's take a look at how the motifs have played out for the proliferation of the thylacine's popularity and cryptidness today. Newsflash, thylacine, 2024. The story of the thylacine today includes that of all that leads up to its extinction, but tacks on a new ending. And that is that the thylacine still persists out there in the wild, maybe in a small family unit or alone, and that it's hiding from its fate as a victim of colonial violence. It has persisted past those who tried to kill it and bested the humans. This extended narrative of both thylacine's former verified existence to its now contested post-persecution one is the dominant legend that is shared about the thylacine today. A sort of historical legend with a note about contested existence in the present day to leave it open-ended for the listener to decide. What you see here are some photos that were presented to the public as finally found images of the thylacine promoted by biologist and TV host Forrest Galante. This is a way to open up a conversation about cryptids on Galante's YouTube channel, passing along the notion that these images were genuine and emailed to him by some guy named Henry in the hope that this would inspire a conversation about biology, extinction, and the thylacine. He recants the friend of a friend story of this thylacine encounter, supposedly from a kid and their dad finding a sick dog that turned out to be a thylacine on the side of the road. He walks the audience through an assessment of these images and ultimately leaves the conclusion on them open-ended. Many people online really did feel like these photos could be genuine, or at least close enough to have a lot of deep feelings about extinction bubble up to their fingertips and channeled through Reddit posts. So this was proven to be a hoax, and likely resulted from some photoshopped images of an artist by the X handle Archisuchus, who handcrafted a 1-to-1 scale model of a thylacine. It's really, look at this work. It's really good. Their artwork is amazing, and they play a lot with this presentation and suspension of disbelief for the paleo art creations that they come up with. So they have ones of thylacines like this in sort of fictive environments, or playfully imagining what these animals would be like in real life presently today. But they do this with thylacines and with dinosaurs. So it's kind of a wash. It's like clearly a play that this artist does. Whether the images themselves were taken from this artist and then further altered, or if Galante on his own or with his team were inspired to create their own based on this person's art, none of that's been verified. But the news and these images specifically surfacing again in 2024 incited another thylacine community uproar, and it seems like once a year the last handful of years there's been at least one thing in a given year that's sort of a thylacine community rejuvenator, if that makes sense. I imagine that there's going to be more cases like this in the future, especially in the wake of AI, which I'm sure many of you have thought about the second you saw these pictures, which is the subject of another presentation, AI and cryptids. But for this, again, though, the body, the locations of these images, the uncanniness, threat that sort of taints the whole perspective here, these are all the motifs that are still part of thylacine legends today. But what if I showed you something a little bit more convincing? There's an organization by the name of Thylacine Awareness Group of Australia with a Tasmanian counterpart. Neil Waters, a longtime researcher on the quest to find thylacines in the wild, is unique. He, unlike many institutions, accepts all thylacine sightings he receives from the public at face value. Sharing with others that you've encountered an animal thought to be extinct for years can often lead to ridicule and disbelief. Waters' approach is to undo that and offer blanket acceptance of your reported sighting and encounter. As the founder of Tagoa, he leads the organization in fundraising efforts that support trail cameras that he sets up all over the bush in Tasmania and Australia based on data gathered by mapping out the most common locations thylacines have been sighted in the wild. This does not mean, however, that all of the collected sightings are ranked at an equal level of legitimacy. There are plenty of resources, including the Tasmanian Thylacine Sighting Record Database, that help rank what's considered a credible sighting of the thylacine, and we'll get into some of that too. This, though, first, before we jump into that, is a video from 2021 that was heavily promoted and teased on the Tagoa YouTube channel, claiming that these were the first ever true images of the thylacine caught on trail camera in 2021. He'd finally done it. Waters found a thylacine. Let's take a look at what he captured.
Everybody's hanging to see these photos, so I'm not going to mess around. I'll get straight on with the job of showing them to you. We've got a night image. Now we've got two eyes and a set of ears down here and a little face, tiny little thing. Then it gets really interesting because the animal comes into focus. Clearly no photoshopping or any editing going on here. What an interesting little face. Now my vet with over 30 years experience said there's no way that's a cat with a muzzle that long. Look at those little rounded ears and that broad head. Doesn't look like any quoll I've ever seen before. Certainly doesn't look like a cat. What is it? Who knows? My dog expert that I spoke to before told me that that muzzle was too long for a cat.
Yep.
Would you agree with that?
Yep, I'd certainly agree with that.
So we've got an ambiguous photo, which is black and white because it's infrared at night, but sort of fitting the right kind of shape for a juvenile maybe.
Yep.
Got the smaller rounded ears.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. Yeah.
Image 862. Image 863. Is that a wallaby? It looks like it's walking, not hopping. Certainly a long linear looking body. It doesn't have that large curve on the rump that you'd expect to see. A little bit of shading there, or is that stripes? Definitely got an interesting ear here, because look at this. It's way over near the edge of the line of the body. Not in here narrow like a macropod. They've got small, narrow faces. Bennett's wallabies and paddymellons. I would expect the other ear, if it was in the frame, to be about here. Rather broad head for a paddymellon, don't you think? Image 864, the next image, and the image that I'm hanging everything on because I know what I'm looking at here. And I'm certainly not looking at a paddymellon, in my opinion. But like I said before, there's lots of opinions out there. If you have a look at this animal, you can see several points about this animal which make it much more like a four-legged animal than a hopping one. For starters, it's got a dead straight back. It appears to be walking on all fours. It has a nice stiff tail pointing straight out like everyone reports about thylacines. And what's that we have here? Look, stripes. Several stripes on the tail, several stripes on the rump, and actually like a band going all the way around its back and continuing down on the other side rather evenly, not looking like a shadow that you'd expect to possibly go off straight if that was a shadow. That is a stripe going around its body. If you read Nick Mooney's report, he reports on stripes. It's got the shaggy hair that I've seen on the juveniles in the Adelaide Museum. It's got the right coloured hair. It's that fawny colour. But most of all, it's very stocky if it's a kitten. And again, look at the level of where that ear is in relationship to the edge of the animal, looking down that line.
Okay, is that a thylacine? Let's take a closer look at the criteria for evaluation of a thylacine sighting before coming to a hard conclusion on this one. In the 80s, close to when the thylacine gained widespread institutional recognition as extinct, a Parks and Wildlife officer by the name of Stephen Smith came up with this criteria of evaluation for existing thylacine sightings at that time, which is still used today. So these criteria are ranked on a scale of good, fair, and poor, and each of the 4 criteria are as follows. The description of the animal. Is it accurate? Did they mention stripes, right? Number 2, the observer's credibility and their experience with native fauna. Was the person drunk, right? Did the person have enough sleep, right? What's their credibility? What's their experience with native fauna? Are they a tourist, or do they know what the thylacine is, right? Like, it might make it more credible if a person who is not from Australia visits Australia, sees a stripy-looking quadruped animal that looks like a dog. They're not primed to recognize that necessarily as a thylacine, so that could add to the credibility. The circumstances of the sighting, right? Like what time of day it was, whether or not there was lighting, how long you spent looking at the thylacine. Was it like a 5-second encounter or like a 5-minute encounter, right? And then correlation with other sighting reports from previous thylacine distribution. So, for example, the distribution that is tracked from the bounty payments early on where thylacines were found and collected, all the way to early Tasmanian literature, but also from earlier sightings compared to sightings from the present day are all matched to each other too, to see if that makes sense for where geographically thylacines were distributed in Australia and Tasmania. So taking in what we just saw, now what do you think, right? Was that a thylacine in the camera? Or was it something else? While this tool for evaluating the credibility of thylacine sightings exists, what I'm hoping to add here in this discussion is something a little more folklorically informed, right? I'm less interested in the legitimacy of the thylacine's present existence or the credibility of the observers than I am in the fact that people are still seeing this animal after so many years. How could an animal that has been extinct for almost 100 years still be captivating the minds of so many people? What can the cycle of legendary encounters with thylacines tell us about humans understand themselves in relationship to their environments? I'm sorry to say, if you were really into the notion that those images were of a thylacine, most people seem to agree that the images are dubious at best and likely reflect the backside of a pattymelen, which is a pretty common Australian bush animal that Waters even mentions in that video. So it's likely a strange amalgamation of photography, lighting, nuance, shadows in the bush, and then a pattymelen, probably. Okay, one more. What about one more? A more convincing sighting? This is a sighting from 1973, and I personally find it pretty convincing. Let's watch. wow, this one. Thinking about Smith's criteria of credibility, this video, I feel like, has a bit more weight of legitimacy behind it. The film was shot in 1973, right? Again, so that was a time that's much closer to the official extinction of the thylacine, where there was still like a strong pursuit of maybe it's out there, like we don't know 100%. Around that time, there was an official institutionally funded and curated exploration to try to find any thylacines in the wild, and it didn't return anything, but did result in this criteria for sightings. Additionally, this video was taken in a car, like it wasn't like the person was searching out for it. It's in the middle of the day. And from what I understand about this video, the people filming were two tourists, like on honeymoon or something like that. So they weren't necessarily primed to see the thylacine as a thylacine. They just went like, oh, that's a weird looking dog, right? And they just like whipped out their camera to try to videotape this. So I think that this one is a little bit more legit. I don't know, like you get to be the winner here, or I don't know, you get to be the deciding factor here, because I'm actually not that interested in whether or not it is the thylacine, but that it is continuing and sparking this conversation over and over again about how we know something's extinct, and particularly the thylacine persevering past that persecution, right? That's the thing that's interesting to me. So here, again, taking all these sightings and these present-day examples of people encountering thylacines in the wild, this is where storytelling and belief align in legend. The more questionable or debatable the evidence of the thylacine's present existence is, or any cryptids for that matter, the more deeply rooted a cryptid becomes in society. The truthiness, the debatableness of it makes the thylacine become more rooted in society. Part of this, I think, is the reification of those motifs that I outlined, which are expressions of a kind of ontological worldview that, again, separates humans from the rest of the natural world. And it is a way to kind of process that anxiety and sort of see how the anxiety generated and expressed through particular interpretations or motifs or relationships that we have with non-humans tells us something about how we understand our role in the environment, as well as how it changes, right? Speaking of some of those changes, I'm also interested in the ways that these motifs show up in artwork of thylacines, or that the subversions of the motifs show up in artwork. For example, most of the artwork created representing the thylacine from 2000 onward depicts thylacines in a friendlier way or as a victim of extinction. Historically, that's not been the case, and I would encourage you all to read Carol Freeman's book, Paper Tiger, How Images Shape the Thylacine, because it's a wonderful book. But thylacines, like many cryptids, are now the subject of a kind of cryptid fandom and are viewed fondly across the internet, coded in a sense of longing for what was lost due to hunting, logging, and the damages of colonialism. The fondness has a layer of perseverance past persecution, which is an idea that both cryptid lovers and queer people find empowering and helpful. And cryptids, I think, and the subject of another presentation would be queerness and cryptids, right? Where we think about the sort of symbols in their presence past persecution, or their contested existences, or the spaces in society that they occupy, that they disturb, even when we think about non-normative bodies. All of those kinds of things are all layered in this too. So here I have 3 different examples of this kind of artwork that I found of thylacines online. So the first one is gouache on paper, and this is a depiction of the thylacine hunting or eating a sheep found in a barn, you can actually see the pouch holding its young right at the back. It has the thylacine, I didn't mention this earlier, but the thylacine has a backwards facing pouch. So a kangaroo is upright, right? The pouch opens towards their head. The thylacine, it's the opposite because they're quadrupedal, so they're running through the bush. You don't want anything to get into your pouch, right? So it's backwards. And this moment being depicted is when a farmer stumbles upon the thylacine, who looks very hungry and forlorn and almost like sad and I don't even know, sad and I don't know, just pained at the thought that it was now about to be killed upon discovery by the hunter, by the farmer who had found them in there. The next piece in the middle, this digital artwork, it says evolve or die on it, and the thylacine is kind of like twisted up, and I think that this is an allusion to its extinction, and how it died, but also maybe didn't, because maybe it evolved into something that is much more difficult to track. I'm not really sure. And then the last one is a kind of fursona. It's a 2D art drawing, digital art that depicts a thylacine not on 4 legs, but on 2 legs, not unlike a human, and has some humanoid figures to it, and it's also wearing clothing, and has hair, like human hair up in a bun. So it's sort of like an anthropomorphized version of a thylacine. So examples of the motifs that I mentioned earlier can also be seen here in the depiction of the thylacine's non-normative body types in each of the images, as well as some subversions of the threat to humans or human ways of life, right? I speculate that when the thylacine is detached from land, as it is in its traversing of online forums, in artwork without backgrounds, or decoupled from conversations surrounding ecocide and colonialism, the thylacine appears more friendly and positive, and more as a symbol of extinction defiance, rather than of colonizer guilt over losing such a special animal due to the repercussions of systemic colonial violence. You can see this spectrum in this set of images as well, like how much is the artist, the curator, presently relating to this question of colonialism, this question of violence and extinction, right? Yeah, here's some more art. Giving Life to Legends, an article that I had published in the journal Western Folklore, is about how creating artwork of the thylacine gives physical presence back to the absent animal, which symbolically tells the story of and legacy of the thylacine as both an animal that was alive then went extinct, and also the legend of its present existence today within the process of creating the artwork itself. It's about the act of making the piece of art, depicting the thylacine, the material process that helps tell the story. These two narratives, the one of extinction and the one of persistence, are inextricably linked through its visual representation today. The thylacine wouldn't be the thylacine to humans without this contested existence, right? Here again, I'm curious about the translation of these narrative motifs that I identified about the animal, or about cryptidness of animals, and how that might translate into artwork made that features the thylacine as a central subject. So sort of genre hopping, like can the things that I'm talking about narratively show up in the artwork too? So from my studies, I've identified 3 distinct ways of assessing a potential for an animal to become a cryptid based on the motifs of the stories that are told about that animal. If it has each of these 3 elements, the creature's definitely a cryptid, or it's soon to become a cryptid. I'm currently working towards backing up this claim by examining a couple other examples of presently endangered species, such as the eastern hellbender salamander, and following the existing folk narratives about those animals through their extinction. The eastern hellbender salamander, for example, is the largest salamander in the United States, and people affectionately call it a snot otter or a lasagna lizard, but it's like an over-foot-long salamander that fishermen call poisonous, or that they were unlucky, they would mess up your fishing nets. There's some stuff there that I really got to work through on this, but anyway, I would love your feedback and suggestions for this idea as well. Perhaps artwork could be like a 4th measurement of a cryptid. Like, do people make art about it? Like, that is an important thing that people do related to cryptids, but maybe that's too general. I'm not convinced that that's narrow enough, but I would really love to discuss this a little bit further with you in the comments. I really appreciate you tuning into my presentation today. Did you find all the thylacines? Did you find them all? Did you forget about this? Comment below if you found them all, or if you think you found them all. let me know in the comments. Let's keep talking. You can find me at a bunch of different places. You can email me anytime. Here's my emails on screen. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm either at Thyla Daisy or Mycolore, with an underscore in the center of both of those words. The Mycolore is where I do more of my like personal essays and writing about folklore and mycology and things like that. I have some book chapters on thylacines out in a book that you can buy. It's probably the most up-to-date overview of the thylacine, its ecology, and its role in society that you can get today. So that's a great book. I also have that article that I mentioned, the Giving Life to Legends article, which you can read online. And then my MA thesis was all about this artwork too. That is free. You can download it online anywhere. So thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you somewhere on the internet.
Well, I hope you all agree that this was an extremely interesting range of talks. If you're an expert interested in presenting your own talk on folk zoology, you can contact me at the address shown on the screen. If you have questions about any of the content presented, you're welcome to try reaching out to the presenters. I hope to do this again someday, and if so, I'll see you all then. Thank you for joining us.